Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here for the Resident Readers Program. This is a good day. I can wish you the blessings of St. Bridget, or I can tell you to have a happy Imbolc, or for those of us on the East Coast, the groundhog did in fact see its shadow all up and down the coast. So we've got 6 more weeks of winter. But, yeah. Okay, so before I start reading, this is sort of the second section of my modern poets' tough love. That's why it's tough love too. I want to talk just a moment about modern poetry. Most of us went through college and high school and read a lot of the classic British and American poets, and they were not shy about telling us what they wanted us to think about their poem. I think of someone like John Milton, who wrote thousands of lines in Paradise Lost and told us right up front that he was trying to justify the ways of God to man. Or someone like Alexander Pope, who wrote many, many lines of poetry and then summed it all up in a clever, quotable couplet, so we would be sure not to miss his point. But modern poets are not doing that, and sometimes people are challenged by what modern poets are doing. So let me just sort of give you 2 quotations from 2 modern poets to talk about what they think they're doing. One of them is from Robert Frost, who says, if you have something you want to say, go write an essay. The point being is that you are not trying to tell people things. Well, what is it that you are doing? And this is what John Cage said, who is himself a poet and a musician and a very strange modern philosopher. But John Cage says that modern poetry is, quote, not an attempt to bring order out of chaos, but a way of waking up to the life we are living now. So that's the stuff that I'm reading is going to be from modern poets who are not trying to tell us what they want us to think about their poems. They're trying to frame in an experience, a sight, a singular episode, and then leave it to us to see what we want to put into that frame. Of course, they're directing us, but still, there's a lot more interaction with a modern poem. So I will shut up and start reading some. This first one is by a woman named Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a Palestinian-American poet, and it's called The Art of Disappearing. When they say, don't I know you, say no. When they invite you to the party, remember what parties are like before answering. Someone is telling you in a loud voice they once wrote a poem, greasy sausage balls on a paper plate, then reply. If they say, we should get together, say, why? It's not that you don't love them anymore. You're trying to remember something too important to forget. Trees, the monastery bell at twilight. Tell them you have a new project. It will never be finished. When someone recognizes you in a grocery store, nod briefly and become a cabbage. When someone you haven't seen in 10 years appears at the door, don't start singing him all your new songs. You will never catch up. Walk around feeling like a leaf. Know you could tumble any second, then decide what to do with your time. All right, a poem by Kay Ryan. Now, all of these poets that I'm reading you are poets who are well-known. They're National Book Award winners. They're Pulitzer Prize winners. They're poet laureates. Kay Ryan happened to be a poet laureate maybe 10 years ago. And this is a short poem that she wrote called, It's Always Darkest Just Before the Dawn. But how dark is darkest? Does it get jet or tar black? Does it glint and increase in hardness or turn viscous? Are there stages of darkness and chips to match against its increments, holding them up to our blindness, estimating when we'll have the night behind us? You ever buy a chip for how dark is the night? Now here's a little short one. In fact, I may have to read it to you twice because it's so short. The first time it'll sort of go by you and you'll be stunned, and then you'll have to hear it again. It's by a poet called Galway Connell. It's called Prayer. Whatever happens, whatever is what I want. Only that, but that. Let me do it again. Whatever happens, what is what I want. Only that, but that. Now, how good is a poet that can put 3 is's together and make it make sense? You got to admire that. Ws Merwin, a contemporary poet that's really, like a lot of poets, looks at things at a strange way. And once I read you this one, you'll start You'll feel strange yourself because you may sort of take up his point of view and start thinking about what he's saying. This is a poem. Now, he wrote this, of course, while he was still alive. He's not going to write it after he's dead. But the poem is called For the Anniversary of My Death. Every year, without knowing it, I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me and the silence will set out, tireless traveler like the beam of a lightless star. Then I will no longer find myself in life as in a strange garment, surprised at the earth and the love of one woman and the shamelessness of men, as today, writing after 3 days of rain, hearing the wren sing and the falling cease, and bowing, not knowing to what. Every day you're passing the anniversary of your death, but most of us don't think about that. And another poet that looks at things in kind of a strange way, and we read a poem by him last time, the one I really liked. You might remember. This is a poet, Mark Strand, who talked, you remember the poem we talked about, wherever I am what is missing. In a field, I am the absence of field. Wherever you are, you're what's not there. He has a skewed way of looking at things, too. This is a poem called How We Are Spared. At midsummer, before dawn, an orange light returns to the mountains, like a great weight, and the small birds cry out and bear it up. Okay, now I'm going to challenge you with a tough poem. A poet named Maxine Cumin, early modernist poem. She died, I think, maybe in 2014 or so at 88 years old. So she saw a lot of transition of time. Spent her last years, kind of like Robert Frost, living on a farm in New England. You may find some of this poem a little troublesome. I hope you don't, because it does end up in a place where she wants you to be, if you can last through the middle. Having said that and gotten you all worried, now I'll read the poem. It's called the Excrement Poem, and it is about excrement. It is done by us all as God disposes, from the least cast of worm to what may have been, in the case of the brontosaur, say, spore of considerable heft, something awesome. We eat, we evacuate, survivors that we are. I think these things each morning with a shovel and rake, drawing the risen brown buns toward me, fresh from the horse oven, as it were, or culling the alfalfa green ones, expelled in a state of ooze through the sawdust bed to take a serviceable form, as putty does, so as to lift out entire from the stall. And wheeling to it, storming up the slope, I think of the angle of repose of the manure. The pile assumes how sparrows come to pick the redelivered grain, how inky-cap coprinus mushrooms spring up in a downpour. I think of what drops from us and must then be moved to make way for the next and the next. However much we stain the world, spatter it with our leavings, make stenches, defile the great formal oceans with what breaks down, trundling off today's last barrowful, I honor shit for saying, we go on. Well, it's an interesting poem. It does talk about the perseverance of things, you have to admit. And it's a point of view you might not have considered before. Ada Limon. Ada Limon is a fairly young poet. She's a Californian. She writes a lot about what it's like to be a first-generation Latinx poet in this country. But in this particular poem, she's writing what it's like to be a grown-up, and I think most of us will identify with some of the things she's talking about. It's called Before. No shoes and a glossy red helmet, I rode on the back of my dad's Harley at 7 years old, before the divorce, before the new apartment, before the new marriage, before the apple tree, before the ceramics in the garbage, before the dog's chain, before the koi were all eaten up by the crane. Before the road between us, there was the road beneath us, and I was just big enough not to let go. Hinno Road, creek just below, rough wind, chicken legs, and I never knew survival was like that. If you live, you look back and beg for it again, the hazardous bliss before you knew what you would miss. Okay, Stephen Dunn, another National Book Award winner. We have so many wonderful, great poets to choose from now. This one is his sense of irony, I think. It's called Propositions. Anyone who begins a sentence with, "in all honesty," is about to tell a lie. Anyone who says, "this is how I feel," had better love form more than disclosure. Same for anyone who thinks he thinks well because he had a thought. If you say, "you're ugly," to an ugly person, no credit for honesty, which must always be a discovery, an act that qualifies as an achievement. If you persist, you're just a cruel bastard, a pig without a mirror, somebody who hasn't examined himself enough. A hesitation hints at an attempt to be honest, suggests a difficulty is present. A good sentence needs a clause or two, interruptions, maybe set off by commas, evidence of a slowing down, a rethinking. Before I asked my wife to marry me, I told her I'd never be fully honest. No one, she said, had ever said that to her. I was trying to be radically honest, I said, but in fact, I had another motive. A claim without a but in it is, at best, only half true. In all honesty, I was asking in advance to be forgiven. But of course, you remember, he says, in all honesty, I'm about to tell a lie. Well, okay. I said, this is my tough love, so I'm giving you poems about more troublesome subjects this time. We had one about excrement. Now we're going to have one that's entitled Adultery. Poet Jim Dickey. You probably know Jim Dickey more as a novelist. He wrote the novel Deliverance, if you remember the banjos and the trip down the river. But he's also a really fine poet and a great award-winning poet. In fact, he's written a lot more poetry than he's written fiction. That one just happened to be made into a movie. This is the poem Adultery. We have all been in rooms we cannot die in, and they are odd places and sad. Often Indians are standing eagle-armed on hills in the sunrise open wide to the Great Spirit, or gliding in canoes, or cattle are browsing on the walls, far away, gazing down with the eyes of our children, not far away. Or there are men driving the last rail spike, which has turned gold in their hands. Gigantic forepleasure lives among such scenes, and we are alone with it at last. There is always some weeping between us, and someone is always checking a wristwatch by the bed to see how much longer we have left. Nothing can come of this, nothing can come of us, of me with my grim techniques, or you who have sealed your womb with a ring of convulsive rubber. Although we come together, nothing will come of us, but we would not give it up. For death is beaten by praying Indians, by distant cows, historical hammers, by hazardous meetings that bridge a continent. One could never die here, never die while crying, "My lover, my dear one, I will see you next week when I'm in town. I will call you if I can. Please get hold of, please don't, oh God, please don't anymore. I can't bear. Listen, we have done it again and we are still living. Sit up and smile. God bless you. Guilt is magical." I like guilt is magical. Well, if you're shaking their heads and saying, "Oh gosh, why is she reading these terrible topics?" I will give you a breath of fresh air here. I will give you a pause. I will give you something better. Because modern poets, if anything, are all over the place with what they're trying to say to us. Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Okay, I hope I'm not whipping through. I'm whipping through these pretty fast, but you know, you can play it back. You can find it yourself and read it again because these are such good things. This is one by Billy Collins. Billy Collins is, I think I said last time, is one of my most favorite poets, probably maybe the best of the living American poets right now, certainly one of the great gurus of contemporary American poetry. He's got a strange sense of humor and a strange point of view, as most modern poets do. This is a poem by him called As If to Demonstrate an Eclipse. I pick an orange from a wicker basket and place it on the table to represent the sun. Then, down at the other end, a blue and white marble becomes the earth, and nearby I lay the little moon of an aspirin. I get a bottle from a cabinet, open a bottle of wine, then I sit back in a ladder-back chair, and a benevolent God presiding over a miniature creation myth. And I begin to sing, a homemade canticle of thanks for this perfect little arrangement, for not making the earth too hot or cold, not making it spin too fast or slow, so that the grove of orange trees and the owl become possible, not to mention the rolling wave, the play of clouds, geese in flight, and the Z of lightning on a dark lake. Then I fill my glass again and give thanks for the trout and the oak and the yellow feather, singing the room full of shadows as sun and earth and moon circle one another in their impeccable orbits, and I get more and more cockeyed with gratitude. Okay, now I'm going to challenge you with a harder poem here. It's almost a mystical poem. It's almost a magical poem. You're going to have to kind of let your imagination run with this one a little bit. It's also one by Ws Merwin. Now, Merwin, in his last years, lived out in Hawaii and became pretty much a rabid environmentalist. He always was one, but now he became really very dedicated, and particularly he was in love with forests and became a great contributor to and worker for forest conservation. And this poem came out of that fascination. And as I said, you're going to have to let your imagination play with this one a little bit. And it's a slightly longer poem. It's not, not forever, but it is a slightly longer poem. Okay, it's called The Last One by Ws Merwin. Well, they'd made up their minds to be everywhere, because why not? Everywhere was theirs because they thought so. They with two leaves, they whom the birds despise. In the middle of stones, they made up their minds. They started to cut. Well, they cut everything because why not? Everything was theirs because they thought so. It fell into its shadows, and they took both away. Some to have for burning. Well, cutting everything, they came to the water. They came to the end of the day. There was one less standing. They would cut it tomorrow. They went away. The night gathered in the last branches. The shadow of the night gathered in the shadow on the water. The night and the shadow put on the same head, and it said, now. Well, in the morning they cut the last one. Like the others, the last one fell into its shadow. It fell into its shadow on the water. They took it away. Its shadow stayed on the water. Well, they shrugged. They started trying to get the shadow away. They cut right to the ground. The shadow stayed whole. They laid boards on it. The shadow came out on top. They shone lights on it. The shadow got blacker and clearer. They exploded the water. The shadow rocked. They built a huge fire on the roots. They sent up black smoke between the shadow and the sun. The new shadow flowed without changing the old ones. They shrugged. They went away to get stones. They came back. The shadow was growing. They started setting up stones. It was growing. They looked the other way. It went on growing. They decided they would make a stone out of it. They took stones to the water. They poured them into the shadow. They poured them in. They poured them in. The stones vanished. The shadow was not filled. It went on growing. That was one day. The next day was just the same. It went on growing. They did all the same things. It was just the same. They decided to take its water from under it. They took away the water. They took away the water. The water went down. The shadow stayed where it was before. It went on growing. It grew onto the land. They started to scrape the shadow with machines. When it touched the machines, it stayed on them. That was another day. Well, the next day started about the same. It went on growing. They pushed lights into the shadow. Where the shadow got onto them, they went out. They began to stomp on the edges. It got their feet, and when it got their feet, they fell down. It got into their eyes, and the eyes went blind. The ones that fell down, it grew over, and they vanished. The ones that went blind and walked into it vanished. The ones that could still see and stood still, it swallowed their shadows. Then it swallowed them too, and they vanished. Well, the others ran. The ones that were left went far away to live, if it would let them. They went as far as they could, the lucky ones with their shadows. Nature's revenge. But I mean, you had to, that first stanza is just really sort of, I love that first sentence. They'd made up their minds to be everywhere because why not? Everything was theirs because they thought so. Well, here's a ringer. I have to admit, I threw this in. It's a ringer. The poet is not a modern poet. The poet is about 2,700 years old. Which is hardly modern, but the translation is recent. That was my excuse. The translation is only about 20 years ago. The poet happens to be Sappho. Now, Sappho in her day, which as I said was 2,700 years ago, Sappho was considered the 10th muse by her contemporaries. They thought she was just the greatest thing among poets ever. Most of her poems were lost, destroyed, just things didn't last from 2,700 years ago. And this is a fascinating story to me, so I'm going to tell you quickly. One reason we have poems of Sappho's left is because in the late Egyptian period, they were still mummifying people, but they weren't doing as formal tombs and caskets as they started out doing in the early Egyptian times. They were using basically a paper mache casket. They would take bits of paper, flour, water, make them a nice shape around the mummy, and basically entomb them in a paper mache cask. It turns out that somebody had apparently a manuscript collection of Sappho and used that for his paper mache. And when somebody who was unentombing one of these Egyptian mummies realized it was an old manuscript, luckily this person saved the pages. So we have of Sappho from the fact that she was part of a mummy case that got saved. Anyway, I think that's a great story for why literature somehow, some lasts and some doesn't. So these are three little fragments. We still don't have a lot of Sappho. We just have fragments of Sappho. But this new translation by a woman named Mary Bernard that came out 20 years ago, you read these poems by Sappho and you think, this woman could have been writing this year. I mean, this is how contemporary the poems are. Her vision is incredibly contemporary. And I'll read you these three fragments and you'll see what I'm saying. This is fragment number 84. If you are squeamish, don't prod the beach rubble. This is fragment number 87. We know this much. Death is an evil. We have the God's word for it. They too would die if death were a good thing. And this is number 64. Tonight I've watched the moon and then the Pleiades go down. The night is now half gone. Youth goes. I am in bed alone. I mean, that sensibility from so long ago, and you think, okay, human nature still knows how to write poems. Okay, I'm going to read you another Maxine Kumin. She's the one who wrote the Excrement Poem. This one is another odd one from her, but this one I think is a useful poem. That's a hard word for a poem, useful. But in this poem, she uses humor to sneak you into the fact that all of us have an evil streak. I mean, you start out laughing with her, and when you get to the end of the poem, you realize you have been seduced into real nastiness with her. And she does it on purpose. I think she's trying to explain things like how good Germans became Nazis or how good white colonialists managed to kill Indians. You just don't know what you're doing until you're in too deep to get out. And that's kind of what where this poem is going, I think. It's called, Maxine Kumin, Woodchucks. Gassing the woodchucks didn't turn out right. The knockout bomb from the feed and grain exchange was featured as merciful, quick at the bone, and the case we had against them was airtight. Both exits shoehorned shut with pudding stone, but they had a sub-basement out of range. Next morning, they turned up again, no worse for the cyanide than we for our cigarettes and state store scotch, all of us up to scratch. They brought down the marigolds as a matter of course, then took out the vegetable patch, nipping the broccoli shoots, beheading the carrots. The food from our mouths, I said, righteously thrilling to the feel of the 22, the bullets' neat noses. I, a lapsed pacifist fallen from grace, puffed with Darwinian pieties for killing, now drew a bead on the little woodchuck's face. He died down in the ever-bearing roses. 10 minutes later, I dropped the mother. She flip-flopped in the air and fell, her needle teeth still hooked in a leaf of early Swiss chard. Another baby next. Oh, 1, 2, 3, the murderer inside me rose up hard. The Hawkeye killer came on stage forthwith. There's one Chuck left, old wily fellow. He keeps me cocked and ready day after day after day. All night I hunt his humped-up form. I dream, I sight along the barrel in my sleep. If only they had all consented to die unseen, gassed underground the quiet Nazi way. She leads you into that one. Okay, just a couple more. I'm being hard on you. I know I am. And this is another hard poem. But you know, the things about poets is they frame this world for us. I got to where I don't even watch the news a lot anymore, and I suspect many of us are in that place because it's just so relentless and day after day, and your mind gets, where to go. But poets frame things for us in a way that we can bypass our mind, in effect, and go to something deeper. I know I'm rambling, but I'm trying to explain why I'm reading you these painful poems. The people who are here in the room are laughing at me. This is a poem by Carolyn Forche called The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in a liquor store. We had dinner, a rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I was enjoying the country. Then there was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into the water glass. It came alive there. I am tired of fooling around, he says. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. Something for your poetry, no? He said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. Okay, I'm trying to give you a breather here and give you something good to think about here at the end. This is another poem. Modern poets, again, are messing around with form. And this one, some people would argue that this is a prose poem, that it's almost a piece of fiction, a narrative, rather than a poem. But I think given the continuing metaphors and the continuing threads through it, it can classify as a poem. There are those who would argue, but it's another one by Naomi Shahib Nye, the woman who did the first poem I read you about the art of disappearing. This is one called Gate A4. Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight agent. "Talk to her. What is her problem?" We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this. I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly, "Shu dao a, shu bid uk habiti, stan shui, mi fadlak shu bit siwa." The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly spoken, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely, and she needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there just later. Who is picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and ride next to her. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons, just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic, and found out, of course, they shared 10 friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This took all of 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled out a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts from her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country tradition, always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person at that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. And then my goodbye poem to you here today. This is a woman who was a poet in residence at the Jewish community in Amherst and the editor of the Tikkun magazine. So she's quite a young poet now. But I love this poem as a way of sort of ending this reading of sometimes difficult poems. It's a poem. Her name is Jenna Schwartz. It's a poem called Refuge. Take refuge in the fact that there are people this morning who walked into open fields to feed the goats and collect the eggs. Take refuge in the fact that there are people this morning who made love, heeding only the alarm of bodies needing each other. Take refuge in the fact that a poet somewhere is looking out the window, mumbling to himself as angels deliver him his next lines. Take refuge in the fact that there are people this morning changing bedpans and scrubbing in. Take refuge in the fact that love's frequency can shatter glass houses from miles away, that some people will never sell their souls to the devils of commerce, and that a beggar turned the petal into a prayer bead in your closed fist, though you didn't catch his name. Okay. Thank you for putting up with some hard poems and some of my favorite poems. And that's Tough Love version 2.